Hello, shalom and marhaban. You're listening to Yalla, the podcast which works to combat lies, confront misconceptions, and hopefully, if I've done my job, challenge you to think deeper about things. I'm Amy, your friendly neighborhood biblical resource writer, and I'm so happy you've chosen to spend some time with me today. Well, we're back with episode 11. There was a little bit of a hiatus there. We had relatives visiting, rodeos to attend, shakshuka to eat. It was a whole thing. But I am back and locked and loaded and have so much to say. So yalla, everyone. Let's get into it. Let me pause for a moment. I've been thinking about something recently. If you were to ask 10 people today what came to mind when they hear the word Israel, you'd probably get 10 very different answers. Political, geographic, emotional, but very few would say Israel was once the name of a man who carried a promise for the world. And really that matters, because before Israel was a nation, before it was a headline, before it was a point of controversy, and I think we can all agree it has a lot of controversy right now, really it was a person. It is geographically a small sliver of land on the map, yet it commands extraordinary attention. Some of that attention is ancient and spiritual. Much of it, however, is contentious and confused. And I can't help but wonder whether part of that confusion stems from something surprisingly simple. Many people do not know Israel's birth story. We would never speak responsibly about any people group without attending to their history, yet Israel is often treated as an exception, as though it emerged suddenly without lineage, without memory, without a textual past. Much of the modern conversation focuses on fragmented and often biased snapshots of recent centuries, while quietly dismissing the far older narrative altogether. However, the biblical record presents Israel not as an invention, but really as an inheritance, one that stretches back thousands of years. The name Israel does not originate with a nation or a political structure. It is given to a man, Yaakov, who we refer to as Jacob, who stands within a generational promise first spoken to his grandfather, Abraham. That promise, that through his offspring the nations of the world would be blessed, is not forgotten or reset with each generation. It is remembered, reaffirmed, and carried forward. Jacob is born into that promise, not as its originator, but as its heir. And in a world increasingly comfortable reshaping the past to suit the present popular opinion, it is worth remembering history does not become irrelevant simply because it is ancient, and beliefs do not become authoritative simply because they are loud. So for the limited time we have today, I want to trace Yaakov, or Jacob's, life in 3 movements. First, as the striver, his birth, his name, and the rivalry that would define him. Next, we have the heir, the one who inherits a promise given to his grandfather Abraham. And finally, the transformed, the man who wrestled through the night, would not let go, and in the struggle was wounded. Yet from that struggle emerged renamed. It is in these 3 movements that we begin to see not just the story of a man, but the birth of a name that carries a promise and significance spanning countries, identities, and all of history. Before we move further, though, it's worth saying this plainly. Jacob's story is vast, layered, and deeply textured. There are hundreds of articles, books, and commentaries on Yaakov, and what follows is necessarily selective. In short, I can't explore every detail, but I do want to offer enough of the story to illuminate why the history of the man called Israel matters, and some interesting points for context that many of us haven't heard before that really solidify the fact that Israel was never incidental. Both the man Israel and his offspring, which remember was, and still is, used to bless the nations. The nation, the people, the person were and are purposeful, later to be a kingdom of priests, meant to show the nations around them the life and light of God, of Yahweh, to be a blessing to the nations. So let's talk about this man named Jacob. Jacob's story begins in the womb of his mother Rebekah, alongside his twin Esau. Even before they drew breath, the brothers were at odds, so much that Rebekah cried out to God asking, "What is happening within me?" Genesis 25:22 in the ESV puts it like this: "The children struggled together within her, and she said, 'If it is thus, why is this happening to me?' She went to inquire of the Lord, not just any God, but Yod-He-Vav-He, who many pronounces Yahweh, the personal name of God, reaching out to her own Lord for understanding. To fully grasp this story, it helps to step back into the ancient world where births were rarely seen as neutral events. Something unusual, especially rare, was thought to carry meaning. Across the ancient Near East, unusual births were carefully noted and sometimes even recorded as signs of what might come. Twin births, in particular, were rare enough to draw attention, often seen as omens, if you will, or hints that something extraordinary was unfolding. And in the case of Jacob and Esau, that extraordinary begins before they even draw their first breath. I'm going to go on a quick Hebrew tangent here, so bear with me because it's worth pointing out. The verb used here for struggle is actually the word ratzatz in Hebrew, a word that could be better translated as to bruise or perhaps to crush. And that matters because in English, when we hear the word jostling, it sounds harmless, almost playful. Baby Jacob and Esau are displaying acts of real violence toward one another. Poor Rebecca, even without thinking in terms of omen. Anyone who's been through pregnancy can imagine the intensity of that movement, enough to worry and certainly enough to hurt. When Rebecca cries out, the Hebrew wording is unusual too. Her sentence feels unfinished, almost as if the thought trails off. If this is so, why am I? Sounds a bit existential, doesn't it? Now, I doubt she was pondering the meaning of life in that moment. She was in pain, focused on the present, concerned for her children, and desperate for relief. Some scholars suggest it could have been an ancient idiom, a phrase whose full meaning was clear to an ancient audience, but would be lost to us. Or perhaps it's simply unfinished because of her distress. Either way, it captures her deep confusion and overwhelm. And that is the key point. Rebecca is in deep distress. She doesn't just feel discomfort. She's confused, alarmed, and sensing something extraordinary. Remember our context about rare births? She must have realized this pregnancy was no ordinary event, and so she seeks the Lord. Now, the beautiful thing to me is that her unfinished cry doesn't go unanswered. Rebecca does what the text so often commends. She turns to God, and what she receives isn't a medical explanation, a calm reassurance, or an immediate solution. She receives a revelation. What she experiences as chaos, God names as history in the making, so to speak. He answers her not with the mechanics of her discomfort, but with a kind of poetic prophecy. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. That's verse 23. Now, the text moves very quickly from the birth story to Jacob and Esau as young men, but I want to mention a few things about Yahweh's promise, his response before we go there. His promise too, but anyhow. Now pause for a moment and think about that. In the ancient world, the older son almost always inherited first. The eldest held authority, the birthright, the blessing. That was the expected pattern, written into culture, law, and family tradition. And yet here God declares a reversal. The younger will prevail, the older will serve. This is more than just family drama. It's a radical, countercultural statement. God is overturning human expectations, rewriting the rules of inheritance and leadership before Jacob is even born. And in doing so, the narrative sets the stage for everything that will follow, a story in which God's purposes are not determined by human custom, but by divine design. It's a subtle point, but it matters. This reversal will echo throughout Jacob's life, in his struggles, his inheritances, and ultimately in the wrestling that gives him the name Israel. A name which we will find to hold deeper meaning than we may have even first thought. I want to go on another tangent about the name Israel because it is just, it is so cool, but I will do my best to wait, okay? Now, speaking of names, the next section, the birth, is quite interesting and is what in academic terms is called a prophetic type. That is something that happens or stands as a foretelling of a future event. Remember, names in the Bible are never incidental. They carry identity, destiny, and sometimes even divine intention. Jacob's name is no exception. It foreshadows the journey ahead, the striving, the inheritance, and ultimately the transformation that will come when he wrestles with God and is given a new name, Israel. Cue mysterious music here, right? Let me emphasize the point again, that there are books written on the significance of the names Jacob, Yaakov, and Esau. So I'm going to dive into this extremely briefly. But before naming Jacob, the book names Esau. In Genesis 25, verses 24 and 26 in the ESV says this: When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esav, or Esau. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was called Yaakov, or Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. Esau's name in Hebrew, though the exact meaning is unknown, what we do know is that his name is connected to his appearance at birth. He was born reddish and covered with hair, traits that were actually admired in the ancient world, not mocked. His hair was so striking it was described almost like a garment, a kind of hairy mantle that would have set him apart. There also is a clever wordplay in the text. His hair connects to Seir, the mountainous region where his descendants, the Edomites, would later settle. And his reddish color in Hebrew, admoni, foreshadows an event later in his life, the famous moment when he sells his birthright for a simple bowl of red stew. And because of that, he also earns the nickname Edom, or Edom, meaning red, which becomes the name of the nation descended from him. So even from the start, Esau's physical traits, his hairiness and reddish tone, are more than just descriptions. They link him to his family line, to his future, and even to the choices and struggles that will define his life. Like his twin Jacob, Esau's story is woven with meaning from the very first moment. Now, what about our main subject and star player here, Jacob? Let's refresh our memory in verse 26. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, so that his name was called Jacob. Okay, so right from birth, Jacob's life is marked by struggle and rivalry. He literally reached for his brother's heel as if trying to overtake him. His name, Yaakov, reflects this action, actually. In Hebrew, is connected to the word for heel, capturing the moment of his birth. Some scholars also see wordplay with the word for to cheat or deceive in the name in the Hebrew akav or akov, a nod to the later stories in which Jacob outmaneuvers Esau to secure the birthright and blessing. Others even suggest it may even mean something such as God protects, emphasizing that despite his scheming and struggles, Jacob's life is under divine guidance. See, like Esau, Jacob's name isn't just a label, it's a story. From the very start, his name signals who he is, the struggles he will face, and the destiny that will follow him. The meaning here foreshadows the complex, layered life that lies ahead. Now that we've met Jacob and Esau, seen their birth and general understanding of the meaning behind their names, we come to a defining feature of their lives: rivalry. From the very first moment, their relationship is marked by tension, competition, and difference. Esau the firstborn is bold, outdoorsy, and favored by Isaac. Jacob the younger is quiet, deliberate, and closer to Rebekah. Their differences are natural, but they also plant the seeds for conflict that will shape both their personal stories and the destiny of nations. Genesis 25 jumps quickly. One moment the twins are infants in Rebekah's arms, the next they are grown men. The text moves fast, but in just 2 verses, it quietly shows us what fueled their rivalry. Listen again to Genesis 25, 27 through 28. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Nothing helps kickstart a rivalry like parents favoring other children. We can all imagine what that may have felt like inside that household. Some of us may even know what that feels like today. It's almost as if the text is saying, nothing more needs to be said here. Rivalry established. But those 2 verses say even more than what we might notice at first. Esau is described as a skillful hunter, a man of the open country. He is rugged, outdoorsy, comfortable away from the settled life. In the ancient world, hunters could be admired for strength and independence, but in Israel's story, hunting wasn't always necessarily a noble calling. It placed Esau outside the camp, away from the center of a communal life, one could say. Interestingly, his descendants would later settle outside the land of promise as well, in Edom. There's also an early hint of weakness in Esau's character. He's called skillful, but as the narrative unfolds, we'll see he often appears impulsive. He lives by appetite, hunger, instinct, immediate need. He is driven by the moment. And speaking of appetite, I have to point something out because this is just too funny to me. When the ESV says Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, the Hebrew is even more vivid. It literally says Isaac loved Esau because wild game was in his mouth. That just makes me laugh. I almost wish the translation kept it that way. You can just picture it, Isaac savoring the venison, And honestly, I do love my venison. Anyone else? But humor aside, that detail matters. Isaac's affection is tied to appetite. His preference is connected to what Esau brings to the table. That becomes important later. Jacob, on the other hand, is described as a quiet man, dwelling in tents. The Hebrew word can mean whole, steady, even blameless in other contexts. Here it likely suggests someone settled, thoughtful, perhaps deliberate. Jacob isn't roaming the fields. He stays near the household. He is embedded in the family life. But quiet does not mean innocent, and we'll soon see Jacob is capable of strategy and deception. His rise is not grounded in moral superiority, it is grounded in God's sovereign choice. Then the division happens. Isaac loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Each parent favors a different son here. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they hated the other child. The word for loved here can also mean strong preference, but preference within a family can quietly plant seeds of division. Isaac aligns with Esau, both men connected in different ways to appetite and immediacy. Rebekah aligns with Jacob. Perhaps she remembered the prophecy spoken before they were born. Or perhaps Jacob's temperament simply resonated with her. Either way, the household is split. Personality differences, parental favoritism, competing desires. The rivalry that began in the womb is now fully alive in the home and has been simmering for years. But rivalry doesn't stay in the shadows forever. Eventually, it demands a moment, a choice that reveals what's really in the heart. And in Genesis 25, that moment isn't displayed on the battlefield, but over a bowl of lentil stew. Now, I do find it interesting that just after we're told Isaac loved Esau for the wild game he brought home, the very next scene opens with Jacob cooking stew. You almost wonder, could they have just combined forces? Venison, lentil stew? That could have solved a lot of problems, huh? But instead of collaboration, we get confrontation. Genesis 25, verse 29 in the ESV says, "Once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, 'Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted.' Therefore his name was called Edom. Jacob said, 'Sell me your birthright now.' Esau said, 'I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?' Jacob said, 'Swear to me now.' So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright." Whoa, that escalated quickly. Esau responds dramatically, "I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" Jacob presses him, "Swear to me now." And just like that, Esau swears, the deal is struck, a birthright is exchanged for bread and lentil stew. Now, we know it's lentil, by the way, because the text will tell us later. But anyhow, then comes one of the most haunting lines in the passage. "Thus Esau despised his birthright." Nothing solidifies sibling rivalry like selling your future for dinner, right? But to understand why this moment matters so deeply, we need to understand what a birthright actually was. I want to take a moment to hone in on this. Now, before I do, I also want to mention the fact that swearing back then, a type of covenantal promise, I suppose you could say, was irrevocable. It was something serious. And I think in modern times, we often don't really understand that. So this is a serious deal, to say the least. But now, in the ancient world, the firstborn son held a position of enormous privilege and responsibility. This system, called primogeniture, that's a fun Scrabble word, primogeniture, meant the eldest son received a double portion of the inheritance. In a family of 2 sons, that meant Esau would receive 2/3 of Isaac's estate, and Jacob 1/3. But it wasn't just about money. The birthright also meant leadership. The firstborn would become the head of the family after the father's death, responsible for protecting, providing for, and representing the entire household. It was authority, stability, and legacy. In other words, this wasn't pocket change. And while primogeniture was common in the ancient world, there's very little evidence of someone casually selling a future inheritance like this. Fathers could override the system if they chose, but for a son to voluntarily surrender it is extremely rare. Esau doesn't pause. He doesn't negotiate. He doesn't reflect. He is hungry. And in that moment, appetite outweighs inheritance. Jacob, meanwhile, is calculating. He sees opportunity. But even here, it's important to notice something. Obtaining the birthright is only half the equation. In the ancient world, the father's blessing was the formal recognition of the heir. And that part of the story is still to come. For now, what we see is this. One brother, driven by immediate one brother striving for the future. Esau lives for what fills his stomach. Jacob schemes for what he believes will secure his destiny. And the text leaves us with that sobering conclusion. Esau despised his birthright, not because he hated it, but because in that moment he valued something else more. I also want to take a moment to talk about that red stuff, the stew that must have smelled amazing, causing Esau to desire it so eagerly. Let's recall what verses 29 and 30 say. Once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted." Therefore his name was called Edom. When Esau bursts in from the field, the Hebrew makes his desperation almost dramatic. Our English Bibles say, "let me eat," but the verb behind it is much stronger. It carries the idea of gulping down or devouring. This isn't calm conversation. This is a man speaking from raw hunger. You can almost hear the urgency in his voice. "Quick, let me swallow some of that red stuff." And notice how he describes the stew. He doesn't call it lentils, he just calls it that red stuff. The Hebrew repeats the word for red, almost like he's pointing at it. That red stuff. It sounds impulsive, crude, immediate. Then the text says he's famished, and in the Hebrew that word is placed right at the front of the clause for emphasis. It's as if he is saying, "I'm starving." Now, whether he's truly at the point of death or just dramatically hungry, the language shows he feels overwhelmed in that moment. And again, the narrator reminds us that this red moment is tied to his nickname, Edom, meaning red. It circles back to his birth when he was described as reddish. The wordplay connects his appearance, his appetite, and now his decision. Remember also that Esau is described as a well-equipped man of the field and able to defend himself, and yet Jacob is shown as the shrewd one of the two, able to cause the skilled hunter to surrender his whole birthright. We've walked carefully through the early life of Jacob. Now the text shifts briefly to Isaac, Jacob's father, and his dealings with the Philistines. All right, we're going to go on a bit of an important rabbit trail here. At first glance, that might feel like a detour, but it's actually important, especially because many, or let's be honest, most people today aren't familiar with the ancient origins of the term Philistine, or how it eventually connects to the later name Palestine. So let's take a short, purposeful rabbit trail. Genesis 26 opens this way. Now there was a famine in the land, and Isaac went to Gerar in the Hebrew. That's funner to say too, I think. But anyhow, Isaac went to Gerar, to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. Gerar was located in the southwest region of Canaan. Think Mediterranean coastal plain, near what would later be Gaza. If Isaac had continued south toward Egypt, he would have passed directly through Philistine territory. And the Lord stops him there, reaffirming the covenant promise first given to Abraham. So who are the Philistines? Now listen to this, because it's really going to help you understand the term Palestine. Historically, the Philistines were not originally Canaanite, and they were not Arabian tribes migrating north. Most evidence suggests they were part of a larger group known as the Sea Peoples, maritime groups who moved through the eastern Mediterranean around the 12th century BC. Egyptian inscriptions from the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III, particularly at his mortuary temple at Medina Habu, mention a group called the Peleset, widely identified with the biblical Philistines. These inscriptions describe Egypt's battles against these sea peoples and even depict them with distinct Aegean-style feather headdresses. Now, after being defeated by Egypt around 1190 BC, some of these groups were settled along the southern coastal region of Canaan in cities like Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron. These 5 cities became the heart of Philistine territory. Biblical references also connect the Philistines with Kaftor, which many scholars associate with Crete or the broader Aegean region. See Amos 9:7 and Jeremiah 47:4. Archaeology supports this Mediterranean connection. Pottery styles and material in early Philistine show strong Aegean influence. So, historically speaking, the Philistines appear to have been a seafaring people who migrated into the region from the Aegean world, not indigenous to the land and not originally Arab in origin. Now, here's where the name connection becomes interesting. The Hebrew word for Philistines is plishti. When the Greeks later referred to the region, they used a form of that word, Philiste. That Greek rendering is where the later Latin name Palestina comes from. Fast forward now several centuries. In 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Then, after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 135 AD, a major Jewish uprising against Rome, the Roman Emperor Hadrian reorganized the province and renamed it Syria Palestina. Many historians understand this renaming, again from Israel to Syria Palestina, as a political move. By using a name associated with the ancient Philistines, long-standing enemies of Israel in biblical history, Rome distanced the region from its Jewish identity, stripping Israel of its name. That is the first clear historical use of Palestina as a provincial land name under Roman administration. So when we encounter Philistines in Genesis, we are dealing with an ancient Aegean-linked people who settled along the southern coast of Canaan. And centuries later, their name, filtered through Greek and Roman usage, became attached to the broader region. So why does this matter for our story? Because when Isaac interacts with the Philistines in Genesis 26, we are seeing early tensions between Abraham's family and a coastal people who would later become one of Israel's most persistent adversaries. This isn't a modern political discussion. It's simply understanding the ancient landscape of the biblical world, who these people were, where they came from, and how many names developed, and how names developed over time. Because really that is the issue here, where names and places come from, because we don't want to be ignorant of what we say. We want to be learned and wise and know the truth. If Jacob teaches us anything, it's that nothing about him is simple, not his birth, not his name, not his rivalries, and certainly not his inheritance. Now, I had hoped to carry us all the way to that inheritance tonight, but like Jacob himself, we'll have to wrestle through this in stages. So in our next episode, we'll turn to Jacob the heir, the man born into a promise he did not create, but could not escape. All right, y'all. I hope this was meaningful and helpful and that we learned something new together. It is my prayer that as we explore the life of Jacob, become Israel, the knowledge of Israel will spread and enlighten those who don't know, but who need to know the truth. So, as always, I'll end with this. Know that you have value. We're created for unique purpose and are deeply loved by God. Ma'asalem, Belitrot, we'll chat soon.